Ida Hawthorne pressed her dusty, scraped hands against her apron and prayed her strength would hold out. She had walked 31 miles through the dry Montana heat without a decent meal in 2 days. She had lost her home, her savings, and her reputation to people who never had to pay for the damage they caused. But she did not let herself cry. She stood at the heavy iron gate of Silver Ridge Ranch and lifted her chin. If the master of this estate turned her away, she had nowhere left to go. She knocked on the dark wood, the sound swallowed by the vast, quiet valley. The summer of 1881 came to the Montana mountains like a heavy weight. The sun drove down hard on the high country, cracking the earth along the pastures and drying the creek beds. The dark pines stood stubborn against the pale, hot sky, but down in the valley, the heat sat on a man's shoulders from dawn until dusk. Gideon Drake did not care about the heat, though he preferred the cool dark of his study. He had lived for hundreds of years, building this ranch from a single cabin into a vast empire of land and cattle. He was a vampire king, a creature of the night, with hair as white as fresh snow and skin like polished marble, ruling over a territory where human laws barely reached. Gideon sat in his high-backed chair at 6 o'clock in the morning, holding a cup of dark herbal tea. The house was quiet enough that he could hear the steady breathing of his workers in the distant bunkhouse and the slow rustle of the wind through the valley. Robert Finch, his foreman, appeared in the doorway of the study. Robert had managed the daily operations of the ranch for 9 years, and he was one of the few humans who knew exactly what Gideon was. He did not knock, knowing Gideon had heard his approach from 3 rooms away. But this morning, Robert looked hesitant. "There is a young woman at the front gate," Robert said, his voice quiet in the cool morning air. Gideon set his cup down, his pale fingers catching the dim light. He did not speak immediately, waiting for Robert to continue. "She walked here from Stone Creek," Robert added, rubbing his chin. "Her shoes are ruined, and her feet are bleeding. She has 1 small bag, and she is asking for work." Gideon stood up, his tall, lean frame moving with a silent, fluid grace that no human could replicate. "We are not looking for help, Robert," Gideon said, his voice low and smooth like silk sliding over stone. "Tell her to go back to town." But Robert did not move from the doorway, which was unusual for him. "She has been standing out there for an hour, Gideon," Robert said. "She has not sat down, and she has not complained. She just stands there, holding her chin up, like she is ready to stay all day." Gideon reached for his wide-brimmed black hat to shield his pale face from the rising sun. Ida heard him before she saw him. There was no sound of heavy boots, but the air itself seemed to grow cooler, and a strange stillness settled over the yard. When the gate swung open, she did not see a weathered rancher. She saw a tall man with hair as white as winter frost and skin so pale it seemed to glow in the morning shadow. His dark eyes held a strange, deep light that made her breath catch. He stopped several feet away, looking at her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "You walked a long way," Gideon said, his gaze fixed on her face. "Yes, sir," Ida replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the trembling in her legs. "From Oakhaven." Gideon listened, his sharp senses catching the rapid flutter of her heart and the scent of iron from her scraped hands. He knew Oakhaven was more than 30 miles away. "Do you have family expecting you?" he asked. "No, sir," she said. "Or references?" Ida felt her chest tighten. "None that would help me. The Pendleton family in Oakhaven made sure of that." Gideon tilted his head, his white hair catching the edge of the morning light. "Why did they do that?" he asked. Ida met his dark eyes, refusing to look down. "Because the son, Arthur Pendleton, wanted something I would not give him. When I refused, they accused me of theft to protect his name. If you contact them, that is the story they will tell you." Gideon watched her face, his supernatural senses confirming that her pulse remained steady, and her words carried no deceit. "I know what a lie looks like, Miss Hawthorne," he said. "And you are telling the truth. You can stay." Gideon said simply, turning back toward the house. Ida blinked, surprised that the negotiation had ended so quickly without her having to beg. Just like that? She asked. Gideon paused, his pale face turning back to her. I do not care about the opinions of people in Oakhaven. Robert will show you the kitchen and your room. Have the midday meal ready by noon. With that, he vanished into the shadows of the porch, leaving Ida with a sudden, strange sense of safety that she had not felt in years. Robert Finch showed Ida to the cookhouse, a small stone building adjacent to the main ranch house. Her room was a modest space off the back, clean but sparse, with a narrow bed and a small wooden chest. He pointed out the kitchen garden, which was filled with dry soil and withered weeds, and the cold cellar stocked with basic provisions. Robert was polite, but kept a professional distance, handing her a neat list of meal times and the names of the 11 ranch hands she would be cooking for. They are hard workers, but they are decent men, Robert said, before leaving her to her tasks. Ida set to work immediately, washed her hands, and assessed the pantry. She found dried beans, salt pork, and some cornmeal, and she began preparing a hearty stew that soon filled the kitchen with a rich, savory aroma. By noon, the ranch hands filed into the dining room, their conversation dying down when they saw the table. They ate in appreciative silence, tearing into the warm cornbread she had baked in the heavy iron pans. A young hand named Jeb looked up from his empty bowl and declared that the previous cook had been a disaster compared to her. Gideon sat at the head of the table, though Ida noticed he did not touch the stew. He sat quietly, sipping from a small cup of dark liquid while listening to Robert discuss the repairs needed on the north fence. His white hair and pale skin stood out sharply among the sun-browned faces of the hands. Yet none of them seemed to find his appearance strange. They spoke to him with deep respect, and he answered them with short, decisive instructions. Ida realized that while he was clearly different, he was the undisputed leader of this community. Over the next week, Ida established a steady routine, rising at 4 o'clock to prepare breakfast before the sun breached the mountains. She learned from Jeb that the dead kitchen garden had been planted by Gideon's late companion, a human woman named Sarah, who had died in an accident on the mountain pass 40 years ago. He has not let anyone touch it since, Jeb whispered, while helping her clear the dishes. Ida looked out at the dry patch of earth, feeling a quiet sympathy for the lonely master of the ranch. On her 6th day, Ida decided to tend to the garden, kneeling in the dirt in the cool gray light before sunrise. She began pulling the weeds gently, careful not to disturb the few surviving roots of the old herbs. She felt a sudden shift in the air, and knew Gideon was watching her from the dark porch, his white hair visible in the shadows. She did not turn around, continuing her work until she heard his silent footsteps move away toward the barn. He had not stopped her, which she took as a silent permission. A grizzled ranch hand named Hank stopped her by the well later that afternoon, holding his worn hat in his hands. He admitted that he had been suspicious of her when she first arrived, thinking she might bring trouble from the town. Seeing what you have done here, the food and the way you care for the place, it feels like the lights have been turned back on, Hank said, his rough face softening. Ida thanked him warmly, realizing that her efforts were slowly healing the long-standing silence of the ranch. That evening, Ida went to the barn to check on Clover, an old horse that had been kept in a separate stall. She found Gideon sitting on a crate in the dim corner, his pale face illuminated only by the faint starlight. He did not need a lantern, his dark eyes catching the light with a subtle reddish gleam. She is lonely down here, Ida said softly, stepping into the stall to stroke the horse's neck. Gideon watched her, his voice low. She has always been here, he said. Animals need company, just like people, Ida replied. Gideon stood up, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the barn. I will have Robert move her closer to the other horses tomorrow, he said, stepping closer to Ida. He looked down at her hands, which were dirty from the garden. You have been working on the garden, he noted, his tone soft. Yes, Ida said, meeting his intense gaze. If it bothers you, I will leave it alone. Gideon was quiet for a long moment before replying, She would have wanted it to grow. She would have liked you. The next day, a rider from Stone Creek brought a letter, addressed to the ranch. Gideon brought it to the kitchen after the hands had gone back to the pastures. It was an inquiry from the sheriff in Oakhaven, stating that a warrant had been issued for Ida Hawthorne on charges of theft. Gideon set the paper on the table, his white face calm. I told the rider that no such person works here, Gideon said. I said we employ an Abby Finch, but the Pendletons are persistent, and they will not stop searching for you. Ida stared at the letter, her chest tightening with the familiar weight of fear that had followed her for months. You lied for me, she whispered, looking up at the pale man standing before her. Gideon's white hair seemed to catch the dim light of the kitchen as he leaned against the counter. I told a corrupt lawman that his information was incorrect, Gideon replied calmly. That is not the same as a lie. You are under my protection now, Ida, and my word is the only law that matters on this mountain. Over the next 3 weeks, the ranch continued to transform under Ida's care. The kitchen garden began to show signs of life, with small green shoots of parsley and thyme breaking through the soil she had carefully watered. She found an old handwritten recipe book in the pantry, its pages yellowed with age, and began using the notes left by Sarah to prepare meals. She felt as though she were reviving a history that had been buried in dust, and the hands noticed the change, eating with a lighter spirit. Gideon began spending more time in the kitchen after the evening dishes were cleared. He would sit in the corner with a leather harness to mend or a ledger to review, his pale fingers moving with supernatural precision. They rarely spoke, but his silent presence became a comforting constant in her evenings. He would drink his dark tea, and she would sip her herbal infusion, the quiet between them filled only by the crackle of the wood stove and the distant howling of the mountain wind. On a quiet Sunday evening, Ida sat on the low stone wall of the garden, reading a small book of poetry she had carried in her bag. Gideon walked out of the house, his white hair catching the silver moonlight as he leaned against the wooden fence. What are you reading? He asked softly. Poetry, Ida said, closing the book. Sarah loved poetry, Gideon murmured, his eyes looking toward the distant peaks. Sometimes I forget how much the humans I have known brought beauty to this cold place. The peace was shattered on a Thursday morning, when Jeb came running into the yard, his face pale with panic. Miss Ida, come quick, he shouted, rattling the kitchen door. Mr. Gideon has been hurt up on the north ridge. His horse spooked at a mountain lion near the rocky ledge, and they fell. Ida grabbed her medical kit, which her mother had taught her to use years ago, and ran out to meet the hands as they carried Gideon in on a makeshift stretcher of planks and canvas. Gideon was conscious, but his left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and his pale cheek was sliced open from a sharp rock. Despite his immortal nature, his physical form could still be broken by sudden violence, especially when caught off guard near the silver-veined rocks of the ridge that weakened him. Ida did not hesitate, directing the hands to lay him on the large wooden table. Robert, get clean water, she ordered. Hank, find 2 straight pieces of wood for a splint. I need to set this bone. She worked quickly, cleaning the deep gash on his cheek with steady hands. Gideon lay perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her face, his breathing slow and controlled. When she pulled the broken bone of his arm back into place, he let out a single, sharp breath, but did not make another sound. She stitched the wound with neat, tight thread and bound his ribs, which were cracked from the fall. His skin was freezing to the touch, and his dark blood was thicker than a human's, but she did not flinch. You need to rest for at least 6 weeks, Ida said, wiping her hands on a clean towel. Gideon opened his eyes, a faint, amused smile touching his pale lips. I cannot rest for 6 weeks, Ida, he murmured. The ranch requires my attention. Ida met his gaze with fierce determination. You can argue with me, or you can heal, she said, but you cannot do both. Robert can manage the pastures, and Jeb can bring you daily reports. You are staying in this room." Gideon looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes softening as he realized she was entirely unaffected by his coldness or his supernatural nature. "Very well, Doctor," he said quietly, closing his eyes. That night, Ida sat in a chair by the window, watching over him as he slept. The mountain wind moved through the pines outside, but inside the quiet room, she felt a profound sense of safety that had nothing to do with locks or gates, and everything to do with the pale man resting in the bed. Gideon tried to get out of bed on the second day of his recovery, but Ida caught him before his boots touched the floor. She walked into the room to find him sitting on the edge of the mattress, his face pale with pain, as he tried to pull on his boot with his one good hand. "No," she said firmly, taking the leather boot from his grip and setting it back on the floor. Gideon sighed, leaning back against the headboard. "I am not accustomed to being idle," he admitted. "You have 3 cracked ribs and a broken arm," Ida reminded him, sitting on the chair beside the bed. "Even a king must rest when his body is broken." Gideon looked at her, his white hair messy against the pillow. "You are very stubborn, Miss Hawthorne," he said. "I have survived hundreds of years of winters, battles, and change. Yet I am defeated by a human woman with a bowl of soup." Ida smiled, pouring him a fresh cup of water. "I take that as a compliment," she said. Over the next week, the ranch adapted to Gideon's recovery on the porch. He sat in a large wooden chair shaded from the direct sun, running the estate by voice and written notes. Jeb rode back and forth between the pastures and the house, bringing updates about the water levels and the cattle. Ida stayed close, bringing him tea and ensuring the hands did not exhaust him with unnecessary details. She watched him work, amazed by his sharp mind and the quiet respect he commanded from everyone. A second letter arrived from Oakhaven, this time from a lawyer named Arthur Pendleton's family representative, warning that anyone harboring Ida Hawthorne would face severe legal consequences under territorial law. Gideon read the letter with a cold, pale expression, his fingers folding the paper with slow deliberation. "They are trying to use the law as a weapon," he said to Ida, "but I have my own resources. I have sent a rider to Helena to bring my lawyer, Oliver Kent. He will handle this." Ida sat at the kitchen table that night and wrote down her full account of what had happened in Oakhaven. She wrote about her father's debts, the pressure to marry Arthur Pendleton, and the night Arthur had tried to force his way into her room. She wrote about how she had fled, and how the family had fabricated the theft charge to ruin her. When she finished, she put her head on her arms and wept quietly, the old memories cold and sharp in her chest. She did not hear Gideon enter the kitchen, his silent movement bringing a cool breeze into the warm room. He sat in the chair across from her, his pale hand reaching out to cover hers. He did not offer empty words of comfort, but the cold touch of his skin felt solid and grounding, like an anchor in a storm. "You do not have to carry this alone anymore, Ida," he said softly. "Your story is real, and we will make them face the truth." The following Sunday, Ida decided to go to the church in Stone Creek, wanting to show the townspeople she had nothing to hide. She wore her best blue dress and walked into the small wooden building with her head held high. But the whispers began the moment she sat down, and several women she had spoken to previously turned their faces away when she passed. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of their judgment, her hands shaking in her lap as the service began. Afterward, in the yard, a respected widow named Prudence Clay walked up to Ida. Prudence was a sharp-eyed woman who ran her own cattle operation, and she had known Gideon's family for decades. She took Ida's arm in a firm grip, walking her past the staring townspeople with a calm, deliberate smile. "Pay them no mind, my dear," Prudence whispered. "Half of these people have secrets twice as dark as any rumor they have heard about you. You are welcome at my ranch any time." When Ida returned and told Gideon about Prudence's kindness, his pale face softened with relief. "Prudence is a good woman," he said, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped behind the mountains. She knows what it is to stand against the crowd. The others will come around in time, or they will not, and it will not matter. We do not need their permission to live our lives." Ida looked at him, realizing that his strength was not just in his power, but in his complete indifference to the fear of others. Oliver Kent, the lawyer from Helena, arrived on a Thursday afternoon, his carriage dusty from the long journey. He was a sharp, direct man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a quick mind. He spent several hours in Gideon's study, reading Ida's written statement and examining the legal letters from Oakhaven. "The jurisdictional grounds are weak," Oliver explained, stepping out to the porch where Ida and Gideon waited. "But the Pendletons have deep connections. They are trying to force a local judge to issue an arrest order." Prudence Clay visited the ranch the next morning, bringing a jar of preserves and her formal support. She sat with Ida in the garden, looking at the blooming green rows of herbs and vegetables. "You have done a beautiful thing here, Ida," Prudence said, touching a green leaf. "This garden was dead for 40 years. Gideon was dead in his own way too. You have given this place a heart again." Ida looked toward the house, her feelings for the pale king growing deeper with each passing day. That evening, the peace of the ranch was shattered by the sound of multiple horses approaching the gate. It was late, the moon high and cold in the dark sky. Ida looked through the kitchen window and saw 4 riders stopped at the gate, one of them carrying a burning torch that cast long, dancing shadows across the yard. They were men from the town, led by a local troublemaker named Frank, who had been drinking and worked themselves into a fury over the rumors of a fugitive. "Drake!" Frank shouted, his voice rough and slurred. "We want the woman. Hand her over to the law, or we will take her ourselves." Gideon stepped out onto the porch, his white hair and pale skin looking otherworldly and terrifying in the orange glow of the torchlight. He walked slowly down the steps, his movement so smooth he seemed to glide over the ground. He stopped at the iron gate, looking at the riders with dark eyes that flashed a dangerous, crimson red in the shadows. "This is private land," Gideon said, his voice quiet, but carrying a strange power that made the horses stir in fear. "The woman who works here is under my protection. There is no valid warrant in this county. If you have a legal claim, you can bring it to Judge Holloway in the morning. Or you can ride back to town right now and pray I forget your faces." Hank and Robert appeared behind him, holding rifles, their faces grim and determined. The riders looked at Gideon, then at the armed hands, and the courage began to drain from Frank's face. The supernatural coldness radiating from the pale rancher was enough to make even a drunk man sober. Without another word, Frank turned his horse, and the 4 riders galloped back down the dark road, their torchlight fading into the distance. Gideon turned to see Ida standing on the porch, her face pale but her eyes steady. "Go inside, Ida," Gideon said, his voice tight, as he struggled to control the ancient, dark hunger that rose when his protective instincts were triggered. "I am not made of glass, Gideon," she replied, stepping down to meet him. Gideon looked at her, his dark eyes slowly returning to their normal shade. "I know that," he whispered. "But if you stay out here, I am going to do something that is not appropriate for a host, and I would rather keep my manners." The next morning, Robert returned from town with troubling news. A man had arrived from Oakhaven, staying with a local merchant on the South Road. "His name is Arthur Pendleton," Robert said, his face grim. "He is telling everyone in town that he is Ida's husband, that she is a runaway wife who is mentally unstable, and that he has come to take her home. The townspeople are listening to him, Ida. He is very convincing." Ida felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, but she refused to let it defeat her. "I am not his wife," she said, looking at Gideon. "My father agreed to a marriage contract to settle a debt, but I fled before the papers were signed. My real name is Ida Hawthorne, and I will not let him drag me back to that prison." Gideon stepped closer, his white face hard as stone. "Nobody on this ranch will ever call you by his name," he said. "You are safe here, Ida." Arthur Pendleton rode up to the Silver Ridge Ranch on a clear Tuesday morning, arriving alone on a fine bay horse. He wore a clean, expensive coat and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. He stopped at the gate, tipping his hat politely to Robert Finch, before looking toward the house. "I have come to speak with my wife, Clara," Arthur said, using the name he had fabricated for her. "I know she is here, and I only want to ensure her safety." Ida walked out of the kitchen, her heart pounding but her steps firm. She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze cold and unwavering. "My name is Ida Hawthorne, Arthur," she said, her voice clear in the quiet yard. "I am not your wife, and I will never return to Oakhaven with you. The contract my father made was a shameful transaction, and I am no longer bound by his debts." Arthur's polite smile did not falter, but his eyes turned cold. "You are unwell, my dear," Arthur said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Your family is worried about you. The law is on my side, and Mr. Drake would do well to remember that harboring a runaway is a serious offense." Gideon stepped out of the shadow of the porch, his white hair shining in the morning sun. He stood beside Ida, his pale presence casting a long, cool shadow over Arthur. "Your legal claims are empty, Mr. Pendleton," Gideon said. "My lawyer, Oliver Kent, has already contacted the territorial authorities in Helena," Gideon continued, his voice smooth but dangerous. "We are filing a challenge to your fraudulent warrant. If you attempt to touch Ida, you will find that my influence in this territory reaches much further than your family's pocketbook." Arthur's smile finally vanished, replaced by a dark, calculated look. He realized he was not dealing with a simple rancher, but a powerful force he could not easily intimidate. "This is not over," Arthur muttered, turning his horse back toward the road. Within 2 days, his next move became clear. He filed a formal property claim with the county clerk, alleging that Ida had stolen valuable family heirlooms when she fled, and that Silver Ridge Ranch was liable for a massive financial bond based on her father's outstanding debts. He was attempting to make Ida so expensive and troublesome to protect that Gideon would have no choice but to hand her over. Gideon read the court document at the kitchen table, his white face completely calm. "He thinks he can drain my resources," Gideon said, looking up at Ida. "But he does not know that I have lived through empires rising and falling. A paper claim from a corrupt county clerk is nothing to me." Ida sat across from him, her eyes filled with worry. "He is trying to ruin you because of me," she said. "I should leave before he destroys everything you have built." Gideon stood up, moving around the table to stand beside her. He reached down, his pale, cold fingers gently turning her face to meet his gaze. "I spent 40 years in this house feeling like a ghost, Ida," he said softly. "The ranch was just a quiet prison until you walked through that gate. You brought the garden back to life, and you brought me back to life. I will spend every dollar I have, and I will fight for another 100 years before I let him take you." Ida felt a deep warmth blossom in her chest, the cold fear of the past weeks finally melting away. She reached up, placing her hand over his cool fingers. "I will not run anymore, Gideon," she whispered. "We will fight him together." Gideon nodded, his dark eyes shining with a quiet intensity. "Oliver is preparing our response," he said. "We need to contact your father in Missouri. He is the only one who can prove there was never a legal contract." That afternoon, Ida wrote a desperate telegram to her father, Robert Hawthorne, who was living in a small town in Missouri. She pleaded with him to do the right thing, to tell the truth about the verbal agreement with Arthur, and to help her secure her freedom. She gave the paper to Robert Finch to take to the telegraph office, praying that her father's conscience would finally overcome his fear of the Pendletons. The reply from Missouri arrived 3 days later, brought by Robert Finch in the early afternoon. Ida opened the envelope with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the short, urgent words. Her father wrote that there was never a legal, signed document, only a verbal promise to settle his debts. He expressed deep regret for the pain he had caused her, and promised that if a judge required his testimony, He would travel to Montana to stand beside her. "He is willing to help us," Ida said, her voice shaking with relief. Oliver Kent was delighted when he read the telegram in Gideon's study. "This completely destroys the foundation of Arthur's property claim," Oliver explained, tapping his pen on the desk. "Without a signed contract, the bond claim is fraudulent. Arthur's lawyer filed this knowing there was no legal paper behind it. That is not just a civil matter, it is potentially criminal." Oliver began preparing the formal challenge to be presented to Judge Holloway at the courthouse. Arthur Pendleton did not accept the turn of events quietly. He made a desperate attempt to salvage his position by visiting Prudence Clay at her estate, trying to convince her that Gideon was a dangerous, unnatural creature who was holding Ida against her will. But Prudence was not easily fooled. "I have known Gideon Drake for 30 years, Mr. Pendleton," she told him coldly, standing at her front door. "He is a fairer man than you could ever hope to be. Now leave my property before I have my men remove you." The morning of the hearing arrived, the Montana sky clear and blue over Stone Creek. The small wooden courthouse was packed with curious townspeople, whispering as Ida walked in, dressed in her best blue gown. She sat at the defense table with Oliver Kent and Gideon, who sat directly behind her, his white hair catching the light through the tall windows. Arthur Pendleton sat across the room with his expensive lawyer, his expression tight and anxious. Judge Holloway called the court to order, with a sharp strike of his gavel. Arthur's lawyer stood first, attempting to argue the validity of the family debt and the moral obligation of a daughter to honor her father's promises. He spoke of family values and the sanctity of marriage, but his arguments felt hollow and practiced. When he finished, Oliver Kent stood up, his voice calm and confident, as he presented the telegram from Ida's father and the proof of the fraudulent filing. "There is no signed contract, Your Honor," Oliver said, presenting the documents to the judge. "The claim was filed under false pretenses to harass my client. Furthermore, we have a sworn statement from a woman in Denver, Mary Sutton, who was previously ruined by similar false accusations from the Pendleton family. This is a pattern of harassment, not a legal dispute." The courtroom went silent as Judge Holloway reviewed the papers, his face grim. Judge Holloway did not take long to make his decision. He dismissed the property claim against Silver Ridge Ranch with prejudice, stating that the filing was entirely without legal merit. He warned Arthur Pendleton that the matter would be referred to the Territorial Commissioner for a formal investigation into fraud. "This court will not be used as a tool for personal vendettas," the judge declared, striking his gavel to close the case. Arthur stood up, his face pale with defeat, and left the room without looking back. The townspeople began to murmur, but this time their looks were filled with shame and respect as they watched Ida step out of the courthouse. Prudence Clay met her in the yard, hugging her warmly, while Hank and Jeb cheered from the porch steps. On the ride back to the ranch, Gideon and Ida rode side by side, the mountains rising majestic before them. "It is finally over," Ida said, looking at the clear road ahead. Gideon stopped his horse beneath a large pine tree, his dark eyes looking at her with a soft, quiet warmth. "I have lived a very long time, Ida," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I have never known a woman with your courage. I do not want you to be my employee anymore. I want you to be my wife, to share this land and this life with me, for as long as we both shall live." Ida smiled, her heart full, and reached across the space to take his cold, certain hand. "Yes," she whispered. The wedding was held at Silver Ridge Ranch on a beautiful Saturday morning in late August. The yard was filled with the scent of pine and wild roses, and a small group of friends gathered on the wide wooden porch. Prudence Clay stood beside Ida, who wore her simple blue dress with her mother's silver ring on a chain around her neck. Her father, Robert Hawthorne, had traveled all the way from Missouri to stand beside her, his eyes filled with tears as he watched his daughter finally find the happiness she deserved. Gideon stood at the altar, his white hair neat and his pale face serene in the soft morning light. He looked at Ida as she walked toward him, his dark eyes holding a deep, peaceful warmth that belonged only to her. The local preacher spoke the traditional words, and they exchanged vows of loyalty and love beneath the shadow of the great Montana peaks. When Gideon kissed her, the hands let out a loud cheer, and Hank slapped Jeb on the back so hard the young man nearly lost his hat. A week after the wedding, Mary Sutton arrived at the ranch, having traveled from Denver after receiving a warm letter from Ida. Mary was a quiet, guarded woman of 30, her face carrying the tired look of someone who had spent years running from the past. Ida met her at the gate, offering a warm smile and a hand to hold. "Welcome to Silver Ridge, Mary," Ida said. "You are safe here, and you have a home for as long as you need it." The ranch settled into a peaceful, joyous rhythm as the late summer transitioned into a crisp, golden autumn. The kitchen garden flourished, producing more vegetables than they could use, and the cold cellar was fully stocked for the winter months. Mary Sutton found comfort in the quiet work of the household, her guarded expressions slowly softening as she realized that no one here would judge her or ask for anything she was not ready to give. The ranch had truly become a sanctuary for those who needed a fresh start. Oliver Kent sent a final letter from Helena, confirming that the Pendletons had dropped all appeals and that the territorial authorities had closed the investigation into the fraudulent filing. The threat that had hung over Ida's life for 4 years had finally vanished, leaving her free to look toward the future without fear. She placed the letter in Sarah's old recipe book, on the blank page behind the cover, where the history of the ranch's heart was recorded. November brought the first light dusting of snow to the peaks of the Montana mountains, the air growing cold and clear. The outdoor work slowed, and the hands spent their evenings in the warm bunkhouse, their laughter carrying across the quiet yard. Ida and Gideon sat on the porch one evening, wrapped in a thick wool quilt that Margaret Finch had made for them as a wedding gift. They watched the stars climb the dark sky, the silence between them peaceful and complete. "The ranch is different now," Gideon murmured, his arm holding her close against his side. "It is no longer just a place to hide from the sun. It is a place of life." Ida rested her head against his shoulder, her skin warm against his cold frame. She knew that he would live for centuries more, and that her own human life was a fleeting moment in his endless journey. But she did not feel afraid of the distance between them, for they had built something that time could not easily wash away. She looked out at the dark pastures, the snow-covered garden beds, and the solid iron gate that had once seemed so formidable. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the 31 miles of dust and pain, and realized that every step had been leading her to this sanctuary. She had found a king who ruled with grace, a community that supported her with quiet loyalty, and a love that was as deep and permanent as the mountains standing guard over their home. As she watched the pale moon rise over the ridge, casting a silver light across the quiet valley, Ida felt a deep, reflective peace settle in her soul. She knew the winter would be long, and the cold would bite deep into the mountain soil, but the hearth inside was warm, and the stores were full. She looked toward the coming years with a quiet, certain hope, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their hearts bound in a silence that no longer felt lonely, but complete.